I started recording because of the rain. It was late, close to midnight, and the sound against the glass felt calming, clean enough to bottle. I wanted background noise for editing, nothing important, nothing personal. Just a microphone on the window ledge, red light blinking, cable running across the desk. The steady fall of rain on wood, on metal gutters, on glass panes. I thought that was all I had captured. When I pressed play, the water was there. But beneath it hid another texture. A low, faint clicking, soft as sparks behind a wall. At first I brushed it off. Maybe local interference. A lamp dimming, a charger buzzing. But then the rhythm became obvious. The pulse was steady. Too steady. Not irregular stutters, but a beat, tick, pause, each one, aligning like a metronome. I looked at the old wall clock above the shelves. The sweep of the second hand matched every single throb. I pulled the headphones tighter around my ears, closed my eyes and pressed the cups hard. The rain filled space as expected, rushing like static spread wide. But every second, the undercurrent returned, faint yet sharp, like a short burst of pressure in the canal of the ear. My whole body registered it. The closer I leaned, the more I swore my room moved with it. Not enough to shake books, not enough to make shelves creak. Just a sensation, a subtle lurch forward, then still. Like time had tripped for half a breath, I checked cables. I checked the recorder's display battery full, gain fixed, mic input solid. I toggled switches, played silence, restarted everything. The pulse didn't vanish. I thought about electrical hum, but hum carries a tone. This was impact. A clipped burst, a miniature cut that scissored every second. I grew nervous because I wasn't only listening anymore. I was waiting. The next pulse always arrived on schedule. My chest felt held by a thread, pulled taut each time the clock struck another second. I recorded again with gain lowered, almost whisper quiet. Played back once more. The rain blurred softer, but the pulse pressed louder, sharp against the hush. I began cataloging, my voice speaking notes over the rolling water. I said the time, said the sequence, said the alignment. But hearing my own voice layered with the pulse sent a shiver up my spine. Each burst came right after my words, as if clicking in reply. My mouth dried. I asked if anyone else could hear. It felt ridiculous to say it aloud, asking the dark, asking the silence, but the return pulse landed anyway, right on time. I checked the walls. The radiator bled a low warmth, but no vibration. The desk sat firm, no tremor. Outside, the street was nearly bare. Rain hammered pavement, pooled in drains, hissed on leaves. Still, I couldn't shake the sense that it wasn't rain I'd captured, not really. Something piggybacked on it. Something with its own law of timing. I switched sources. Plugged headphones into my laptop. Played the file there too. The shape was identical. I imported it into editing software. Dragged along the waveform. Every second showed the same intrusion, seeable, as well as audible. Little spikes cutting upward from the tonal bed. I counted 40 in less than a minute, then stopped. My hands hovered, unsure if I should delete or preserve. My first instinct was sabotage, a corrupted file. But second instinct was different. This belonged to something purposeful. I spoke again, louder now into the microphone. My voice cracked slightly. I asked blunt questions, like what? Like why? Answers didn't return, not in language at least. Yet every second kept answering with its own flat burst, mercilessly consistent. I wondered if leaving the recorder on longer would intensify it, or if I'd invite something I couldn't turn off. I clicked stop, heart thumping. But when I slipped the headphones halfway off, I still felt the beat. Not audible, not mechanical, but inside my perception. As though my body had lived along with it for too long already and couldn't let go. I paced the room, rubbing my temples, repeating facts quietly. Midnight, rain, recorder, static, clocks. I tried to sound like someone rational, reminding myself of power lines and routers, stray towers, hidden transmissions. Yet every fact felt thinner once spoken. I could dismiss rain as carrier noise, but I couldn't dismiss the precision. Nature doesn't lockstep with machines. It sways, drifts, falters. This didn't. I left equipment running to see if the sound persisted. I walked into the kitchen, let tap water spill loudly into a steel sink. Picked up the headphones, thinking the rush would mask interference. And yet the pulse carried through, cold and perfect, unbent by volume. My hand shook enough that some of the water splashed my wrist, reminding me I was flesh, not wire. But the equipment didn't care. It kept shuttling signals into my ears. I sat late into the hour, scribbling notes, sketching a rough chart. Ticks in timed squares, annotation along the margin. The longer I stared, the more it looked like a calendar unfinished, like a sequence waiting to be filled with something more than sound. I left the page blank past the first stretch, unable to mark what might come. Fatigue made my eyes sting. The clock on the wall whispered with each advance. Headphones, heavy on my ears, turned each whisper into a knock. I thought back to who I'd lost, how I had once listened for a voice that would never return. I caught myself whispering that name into the static, hearing nothing more than the same response. A mechanical beat, unfeeling. And yet the body still tensed as if a reply had landed. Memory made me weak, made the recording sharper, made it impossible not to lean in closer than I should. Around 2 a.m., I powered everything down. Closed lids, switched off red lights, folded cables. Rain outside had slowed to drizzle, softer, almost gone. I wanted sleep, though nerves twitched restlessly. I shut my eyes and breathed deep. Quiet filled the room. But then came the same second-long pulse, inside my skull now, independent of tape or device. Quieter in volume, louder in implication. It was not the recorder dot, and when I finally drifted into fragile sleep, the last thing I knew was that the rain faded. But the hum, faint and steady, remained with me. I couldn't let it go. By daylight, the memory of last night's pulse felt dreamlike. But I knew it wasn't sleep. It was embedded, and I decided proof could be found in old tape. I dug through folders, stacks of externals. Cheap labeled DVDs, years of scraps. Unused atmospheres, interviews in echoing kitchens. Even dull rain sessions kept more out of habit than need. I pulled one at random. From spring, a night where drizzle and passing cars had been all I captured. I dropped the file into headphones, pressed play, and sat still. First came the hiss of water. Then, buried far down, another flick. The pulse, softer, fainter, but there. The blood went cold in my palms. This wasn't new. 3 months earlier I had stumbled across the same anomaly, recorded it, stored it, moved on. Only I hadn't been paying attention. Or maybe I had dismissed it as trivial noise. But isolated now, stripped bare, it opened up like scar tissue. I checked another file. An interview I had done. The voice of a woman telling me about her father. The clutter of dishes in the background, traffic sighing past her building. And beneath it, running quiet, beating at weird intervals. This time not once per second. It jumped, coming fast, then pausing, as if tripping across tape marks. The lines of seconds no longer mattered. It was aligning to something else, some hidden timestamp embedded by another hand. That phrase rose unbidden in my throat and slipped out. Raw. Am I hearing something stitched across my own past? I'd said it before I realized. Saying it aloud made the thought solid. The hair on my arms prickled. I called a friend who had helped me balance recordings in the past. A sound engineer. Someone comfortable and cool, easy laughter, scarf always loose around his neck, coffee forever in hand. When I explained, he chuckled as expected and said it was nothing unnatural. But out of curiosity, he asked me to send the clip. "Let's see the spectrum," he said. I sent over multiple files. Waited. My leg jittered with nervous energy until he phoned back. His voice wasn't steady now. He admitted that, yes, a layer was visible. A narrow band. Sharp cuts instead of waves. Too precise for environment, too steady for random interference. Still, he joked, maybe leaking electronics or an accidental bleed. Yet the longer he spoke, the less confident he sounded. And when I pressed again, asking outright if microphones ever make patterns like this, he gave a strained laugh and changed the subject. I looped back to the spring rain. The crackle behind it rose strangely strong on new playback. I lowered volume, then raised it. Louder, still louder, louder than memory. Hardware doesn't alter files like that. Waveforms don't inflate on their own. But I sat staring, listening, knowing something had wormed deeper. I leaned into the desk, nose almost brushing the mic, though the mic wasn't running. My voice shook as I recorded an annotation over the sample, narrating what I found. But when I played it back instantly, the overlay fuzzed thicker. The faint pulse cut through my notes as if mocking them. With a wince, I stopped. Left everything silent. Outside, the rain began again. Not gentle, not fierce, but uneven. Disordered somehow. It slapped hard, then fell faint, hit tin loud, then blanked. As if sky itself were adjusting rhythm against whatever grew in my files. My chest tightened. I closed windows to keep it out. Though I suspected closeness mattered little, I phoned my friend again, but only reached voicemail. I stared at my archive drawer, piles of rain files stretching back years. How many of them carried this presence? How much of my past was already compromised, waiting hidden inside those quiet nights I had trusted only as background? My hands hovered, unwilling to explore further. Because every pull-out file risked proving what I wasn't ready to say entirely. That this wasn't confined to now. That the pulse had been standing behind me for far longer, waiting for me to finally turn my head and listen. He called me back the next day. Voice quieter than usual, almost as if he were checking who else might be listening on the line. He said he'd been experimenting with the files. No grand announcements, just a heavy pause before he admitted that when slowed down, the spikes unraveled into something stranger. He filtered, adjusted, laid frequencies bare. At quarter speed, a new rhythm surfaced. Not technology, not weather, human. A cadence of breath hiding inside the static. I sat with headphones, had him guide me through settings. He sent a cut, a sample of only 3 seconds stretched long. I pressed play. At first it was still noise, hiss, bursts, rough edges, but then it took on a terrifying contour. In between harsh tones I could hear inhalation, then exhalation. Not words, exactly, but undeniably pattern of lungs filling and emptying. Something alive trapped in electrical dust. I whispered without realizing. I said it sounded like someone trying to speak underwater, caught half a world away. He agreed. Hesitant laughter masked nerves. He wanted distance from it, calling it a trick of compression, but the laugh trailed too thin. He knew as I knew, machines don't breathe. The cut clawed deep into me. I found myself remembering that one night I'd tried to forget. The accident. How nothing stays still afterward. The phone call I never wanted. The silence that followed, heavier than any shout. People promise voices of the lost live on in memory, but that was a lie. They fade, edges blur. The timbre drifts until you question whether you ever heard it correctly in the first place. I went years without those specific rises and falls. And then within a file I'd ignored for months, I thought I heard the ghost of breathing. It hurt, but I couldn't turn away. Recognition is a hammer. Even a false one cracks clean. I began scrubbing back and forth through the cut, stopping, rewinding, replaying until my ears pulsed sore from pressure. Each time I swore, I caught more shape. The spacing of exhales felt too careful, as if syllables were forming but couldn't breathe past full articulation. There is pain embedded there, and it hooked sharp. My engineer friend cautioned me to treat it as artifact. He told me to step back, sleep, flush ears with silence. I nodded along but ignored the advice. That night, long past midnight, I sat listening as sky outside raged. Rain drove sheets against the glass, thick enough that drops flung sideways rattled like gravel. The storm grew monstrous, wind screeching down alleys. Yet beneath, on looped tape, I heard the pulse cut through, unshaken by elements. Even amplified thunder couldn't drown it. I pressed my eyes shut and let recordings fill space. Time warped. Repetition draped heavy as fabric. The more exhausted I got, the more syllables appeared inside the noise. Not clear. Not whole words. Stretched fragments. And with them came that unbearable tug in my chest. The pull of recognition you pray for, and fear. Bed became anchor as I lay listening. The hum portioned seconds one by one, relentless as heartbeats. Every pulse felt like presence hovering by my head, seated in silence just beside me. Rain screamed louder and louder, battering until windows quivered. None of it shook the rhythm. I clutched headphones more tightly and whispered their name into darkness as my throat scraped raw. My breath tangled with theirs. And whether dream or real, the static almost answered. I left the desk and its cables behind. The apartment was too small, too controlled, too close to my own imagination. If the signal really lived inside the rain, then it had to be tested outdoors, where storms reigned without roofs or walls to blame. I packed a pair of handheld recorders, extra batteries, and one battered notebook. The forecast promised heavy rainfall by nightfall. By early evening, gray rolled down over the city. The park lay broad and near empty, slick paths gleaming like mirrors. I sheltered under an elm until drizzle swelled into sheets. Then I clicked record, one device strapped to my chest, another braced on a bench. My breath steamed white around me, lungs working against the wet chill. Hood drawn low, I told myself these takes would settle it. Either the hum lurked truly in the air, or else it haunted my home alone. The storm roared for hours. I sat drenched, careful to rotate recorders, whispering notes between gusts. My midnight fingers stiffened numb, and I packed everything back into the bag, shoes slapping mud on the walk home. It felt feverish, yet almost exhilarating, to believe I was running an experiment against nature itself. When I pressed play the next morning, adrenaline cracked clean through me. The files didn't sound like what I remembered. Rain fell heavy as expected, but quickly became strange, folded into layers that never coexisted in that park. One downpour surged sharp against paving stones, then evaporated mid-file to lighter drizzle, then returned as hammering sheets without pause between. The edits weren't subtle. Something had stacked weather unnaturally, arranging rainfall as though it could be shuffled like audio clips. Then came thunder cracks. I remembered the storm. There had been no strikes near me, no thunder at all. Yet my recording carried rolls of bass, each one stretched long and menacing. I slammed stop, thumb trembling, then pressed play again to verify. The same impossible thunder boomed over rain. That kept twitching out of step with my memory. The engineer confirmed my suspicion in his clipped tone. He examined the files I sent, reported strange clock drift. Digital time codes refused to march evenly. Sections repeated by a second. Others swerved forward, skipping beats before looping back. He muttered that such corruption across multiple files made no sense, and admitted it unsettled him more than electromagnetic bleed ever could. If time itself bent inside the recording, then what surface laws had failed? With notebook open, I scrawled furiously, marking timestamps, circling oddities, documenting every crack and doubled second. It felt necessary. Proof on paper, undeniable logic. Yet with the ink drying, unease seeped deeper. Logic pinned the events down, but the result was worse. Because proving it stripped me of excuses. These weren't glitches. They were insertions, manipulations so deliberate, they mocked my attempts at control. By night, I replayed sections in the dark. The false thunder leaned close in headphones, shaking like a presence I should have seen. Chills drowned my skin, though radiators hissed warm. It was impossible to hold tight to one memory of the storm. The files began convincing me there had been lightning, convincing me pavements had been pounded harder than I recalled. Mismatched rains piled in confused towers, louder than truth, crowding out recollection. For the first time, I hated my obsession. Because once you confirm alteration, you no longer trust your memory of anything untouched. If storms can be edited, what about silence? What about voices? Every second I had lived might be brittle as tape, ready to be folded back at the strike of a hidden pulse. And as evening's real rain returned against my pains, I swore the rhythm fell slightly wrong, cut short in places, heavy in others. It was embedding false weather into the real sky, training me to believe it always had. I drafted requests carefully. Plain letters at first, then digital forms, citing public rights and archive transparency laws. I wrote to meteorological offices, data centers, university labs. Each request asked for one thing: logs of atmospheric anomalies, spikes during heavy rainfall. I left the language polite, understated, so as not to trigger suspicion. Still, I felt unease as the messages went out, scattering into networks beyond my reach. Replies arrived faster than expected. Form letters, neat headers, brisk signatures. What alarmed me wasn't the denials themselves. Of course they denied anomalies, but the rhythm of the words. Every reply mirrored the others. Same phrasing, same length of sentences, sometimes identical down to the keystroke. It was bureaucracy wearing a mask too clean, as if typed by template or perhaps automated entirely. Each one insisted there was no evidence of interference. Hyper-specific questions about rainfall, frequency were answered not with nuance, but with verbatim lines. No irregularities have been recorded. I began replaying files obsessively. With each listen, the static no longer lay flat, but swelled into layered bands. Imagine chords struck not on an instrument, but on time itself. Whole family of sounds rising, eerie harmonies built from skipped seconds. I listened late into the night, felt apartments around me drift away while I charted impossible melodies. If time bent, this was its hymn. Against the recording's hum, I admitted what I'd hidden even from myself. I told the tape openly, almost shameful. These distortions mirrored my own dreams after the accident. Weeks of jolting awake from loops, moments replayed, seconds folded back into themselves. Dreams where voices repeated the same syllable until I awoke sweating. The recordings were not only unnatural, they were personal. Cruel mirrors dressed in rain sounds. Institutions declared nothing existed. They signed their denials, pressed them through machinery, handed me polished voids. But my devices refused the silence. Whatever hovered on the rainfall found ways to persist. Whether in the spectrum from a city park, or through interference blooming beside a microwave's hum, or tucked deep behind a kitchen interview. Wherever I pressed record, it found shape. It violated excuses cleanly. I leaned back in the chair tonight, headphone pads damp with hours of listening. I told the audience inside my recorder that I wished the institutions had been right. It would have been easier to believe in glitch. But the tapes insisted louder with each attempt. And as I ended this session, I glanced at the waveform still burning bright. Signal stronger than before, louder, a new file already waiting to be played. I drafted requests carefully. Plain letters at first, then digital forms, citing public rights and archive transparency laws. I wrote to meteorological offices, data centers, university labs. Each request asked for one thing: logs of atmospheric anomalies, spikes during heavy rainfall. I left the language polite, understated, so as not to trigger suspicion. Still, I felt uneasy as the messages went out, scattering into networks beyond my reach. Replies arrived faster than expected. Form letters, neat headers, brisk signatures. What alarmed me wasn't the denials themselves. Of course they denied anomalies, but the rhythm of the words. Every reply mirrored the others. Same phrasing. Same length of sentences, sometimes identical down to the keystroke. It was bureaucracy wearing a mask too clean, as if typed by template or perhaps automated entirely. Each one insisted there was no evidence of interference. Hyper-specific questions about rainfall, frequency were answered not with nuance, but with verbatim lines. No irregularities have been recorded. The uniformity stung. I sat with printouts spread across the desk, highlighted repeating phrases, circled identical punctuation. I whispered into my tape journal that silence was never this tidy. True incompetence produces varied excuses, different ways of deflecting. This, though, was a single voice transmitted through multiple signatures. An echo in text. Frustrated, I dove elsewhere. Old corners of the internet where retired radio operators left digital dust behind. Forums aged and abandoned, their posts creaking with 2-decade log dates. Buried amid discussions of antenna models and storm reports, I found fragments about ghost stations. Signals faint as whispers, often timed with heavy weather. Operators claimed odd spikes distorted bands during rainfall, signals vanishing once skies cleared. Several wrote of pulsing interference, rigid intervals echoing past storm fronts. None could prove it fully, but their language mirrored my experience so tightly my chest clenched. I began replaying files obsessively. With each listen, the static no longer lay flat, but swelled into layered bands. Imagine chords struck not on an instrument, but on time itself. Whole family of sounds rising, eerie harmonies built from skipped seconds. I listened late into the night, felt apartments around me drift away while I charted impossible melodies. If time bent, this was its hymn. Against the recording's hum, I admitted what I'd hidden even from myself. I told the tape openly, almost shameful. These distortions mirrored my own dreams after the accident. Weeks of jolting awake from loops moments replayed, seconds folded back into themselves. Dreams where voices repeated the same syllable until I awoke sweating. The recordings were not only unnatural, they were personal. Cruel mirrors dressed in rain sounds. Institutions declared nothing existed. They signed their denials, pressed them through machinery, handed me polished voids. But my devices refused the silence. Whatever hovered on the rainfall found ways to persist. Whether in the spectrum from a city park, or through interference blooming beside a microwave's hum, or tucked deep behind a kitchen interview. Wherever I pressed record, it found shape. It violated excuses cleanly. I leaned back in the chair tonight, headphone pads damp with hours of listening. I told the audience inside my recorder that I wished the institutions had been right. It would have been easier to believe in glitch. But the tapes insisted louder with each attempt. And as I ended this session, I glanced at the waveform still burning bright. Signals stronger than before, louder. A new file already waiting to be played. Set the recorder on the window ledge with nothing to expect. The forecast said clear skies. Not a cloud, not even mist in the air. I wanted silence logged, clean baseline with no interference, just in case. I left it running overnight, the red light steady, and I crawled into bed. The room felt hollow without rain. I listened to the faint hum of appliances, the droning fridge in the kitchen, the dull tick of the wall clock, until fatigue pinned my eyes closed. Sleep came reluctantly, restless and unkind. In the morning, light grazed the blinds, thin and washed. I reached for the recorder, ready to confirm a night of silence. I pressed play while the kettle began rumbling in the kitchen. At first I smiled, only hush, space, the normal empty room. Then slowly it swelled, impossible and undeniable. Rain, not static, not fate. Rain falling dense and loud as if the window pane had been struck through the night. I froze mid-motion, waiting for memory to brighten, for evidence of real weather. But outside the street was dry. Pavement chalk stuck crisp where children had drawn days before. Car roofs gleamed dust, no streaks. No water anywhere, yet rain filled the file. Chills rippled beneath my shirt. Each drop in the playback landed with conviction, bouncing off imagined gutters, trickling down surfaces that never felt water. I carried the device from window to desk, turned volume higher. The sound mapped itself onto my room, convincing me streams slid down glass, though the outside world stayed bare. I graphed the audio, eyes darting across spectrum plots. My chest tightened as curves appeared, bands folded not horizontal, not casual, but curved like clock hands sweeping out symmetrical arcs. 30 degrees, 60 degrees, 90. Too perfect to be random weather noise. It traced intentional shape, deliberate symmetry most microphones never form on their own. I called my ally, sent the cut. He phoned back with terse hesitation. He said that if I wanted his honest opinion, this wasn't bleed through. It carried features of signal broadcast. He told me other things leak radio, stray TV, but their fingerprints are messy, fractured. This wasn't messy. This looked engineered, directed, like someone had chosen rainfall as carrier. He faltered midway, then admitted, "It has the scent of initiation." As if they want you tuned. The word sat iron heavy in my ears. Initiation. I paced the apartment, recorder in hand, playing segments again as I whispered into it. My voice trembling, I described the false rain as though narrating for an audience not yet present. Drops spattered vivid as memory, pulling fragrance of wet earth where none existed, slapping me with phantom presence. Every note recorded, every annotation infused with dread, felt less like my free choice and more like acceptance of a script already waiting. By mid-morning the city outside stirred fully. True life voices chasing dogs, bikes rattling by colored the air. But each time I reached for my headphones, the false rain outshone them, louder than conversation, brighter than real morning birdsong. It felt invasive, pressing forward from speakers directly into my skull, until it was all I could picture. Evidence insisted this was not captured noise but seeded message. I sat with notebook open, handwriting cramped by shaking fingers. I documented decibel rise, logged exact arcs of curvature across the plots. My ally texted again, warning he wouldn't dig deeper if it meant bait. He feared that answering back to such a signal marked you, tracked you. I stared at his words on the screen so long the letters blurred. The device in front of me still hissed water from an imaginary storm, unyielding, rhythm locked in clock-like arcs. Breath ragged. I bent closer to the recorder and whispered. Not notes, not analysis. Just whispered my fear, my awe, the incomprehensible weight that maybe I hadn't stumbled onto evidence at all. Maybe I was invited. Maybe this whole reel of false rainfall was never meant to be discovered. They wanted it remembered, relived, told again. Outside, the daylight sharpened on concrete. Real shadows stretched sharp and certain. But in my headphones, the rainfall grew far too loud. Louder than streets below, louder than the real quiet city lifting awake. The false weather filled the room, saturating every crack and surface until it was all I could hear, all I could breathe. I boarded the train with recorder hidden in my jacket pocket. A simple test, nothing more. Capture the commute's ordinary noise under drizzle. Wheels against track, low chatter, rain streaking glass. The mic's light blinked against cloth, unnoticed. I sat and stared through damp windows at the blur of cityscape, gray edges softening beneath water. For 40 minutes I rode with the press of strangers. Notebook folded flat on my knee. Later at home I pressed play, expecting ordinary clutter of sound. Instead, the file opened into something unsteady. The first section felt normal doors clanging, a cough, steady beat of rain. Then whole breaths of time vanished. Minutes gone. Conversations sliced apart. One man answered a question that had never been asked. Another laughed in a cut of silence that yielded no setup. My own voice, faintly clearing throat, appeared and reappeared, but between versions were gaps as long as stations. I leaned closer, shocked to find rain lingering long past plausibility. A 3-second downpour stretched into half a minute. Drops falling in rhythm bent into grotesque symmetry, like a hand retarded the reel. Static smoothed gaps, filling holes as though hiding losses. The further I played, the less sense remained. I replayed, searching for details of passengers. A woman speaking into her phone vanished mid-sentence, her voice erased. Seat left audible but barren. Another file segment gave an echo of her again, shifted further down the track, repeating half that phone call distorted. Faces once vivid in memory, broke into soundless placeholders on tape. I tested other devices. My phone had caught spillage through automatic recording I sometimes left running. Same corruption. Swaths of blankness, rain-thin and unnatural carving repetition across minutes. Security footage I'd requested months before, archived publicly from that stretch of station, showed even worse. Cameras filmed passengers waiting, their mouths moving in conversation. And yet no audio tracked with their faces. Movements advanced blank, tracks of time threadbare, seconds bleeding from absence. Watching lips flap silently, I felt dread carve core bone. These were not files gone glitched by chance. Not across multiple formats, not parallel in errors. The same missing pockets, the same cruelty of stretch and skip, imposed deliberately. As if recording time itself proved tentative. I paused on one frame of video, stared long enough that white pixels burned my eyes. I asked my recorder point blank, voice breaking into hushed question. How much of a second belongs to now, and how much has already shifted? Rain kept unspooling in headphones. Long washed loops unfurled, moments jumbling out of sequence. The city resumed outside, but in these files order had collapsed. Glimpses were slipping, seconds no longer whole, pieces folded out of place. Proof undeniable and unbearable. He sent the file at dusk, subject line bare, body empty. Just a single attachment, its size oddly small for whatever trouble he hinted at before. I downloaded it, double-checked for corruption, then pressed play. What spilled from headphones wasn't the raw hum I remembered, but something dissected and reconstructed. Rain fell in faint sheets, yes, but behind it lingered thin patterns, layer upon layer. Voices, maybe. Not whole words, not complete, but the rhythm of speech, overlapped with itself like multiple conversations stacked across time. I sat motionless, a hand over my mouth. The sound staggered me, not because it was clear, but because it revealed intention. You could hear cadences start, collapse, restart, fragments of dialogue insistently trying to surface. It felt like listening to ghosts argue through an old transmission. My chest ached. My friend's voice cracked on the phone as he explained how he'd isolated it. He didn't laugh this time, didn't minimize. His tone wavered like a man who'd gone too far down. He described the signal as though multiple versions of the same recording had folded over each other. Overlap across timelines, he whispered through the line, his breathing louder than his words. There were moments where rain vanished between bursts of tone, high and low, shaped almost like Morse but too uneven, too insistent on imperfection. He said he couldn't dismiss it as error. He said he didn't want to touch it again. Voices, he muttered, always reach a listener for a reason. Then the call snapped shorter than I wanted, leaving me hanging with the cut hissing in my ears. That night he rang again, close to midnight. His voice had thinned to a whisper. He said the noise used structure, that it wasn't passive. Maybe not language, but coordinates. A way of navigation, he thought. Like something was marking path or direction across storms. He insisted I stop before words slurred into half-panicked fragments. Then the line cut out, Morning arrived with silence. Calls went to dead tone. Emails bounced back as undeliverable. I sat at the desk, staring at unopened blinds, weighed down with dread. Then came the knock. A courier, disinterested, handed me a small padded envelope with no return address. Inside just one black USB. My teeth clenched as I pushed it into the slot with reluctant fingers. The folder inside carried only a single file. I hovered over its name as my throat tightened. I pressed play. Rain fell steady, but immediately a long hum thundered under the surface, impossibly low, vibrating more in chest than ear. It rose and rose like a graph pointing, a line surging upwards until it throbbed too steady to be accidental. It had the shape of trajectory, the kind of sound meant to signal alignment, to mark where or when dot by file's end. The hum consumed the rainfall entirely, a ceiling of vibration sealing shut. I pulled headphones away sharply as my stomach twisted into knots. My ally was gone, unreachable, his parting gift a file that pointed somewhere. Somewhere not marked on any map I knew. I spread files across the screen, overlapping spectrums until my eyes blurred. Raw audio, field recordings, processed cuts from my vanished allies folder. Hours bent thin as I layered storms together, aligning their pulses, the hums, the irregular thunder chills. I expected chaos, a wash of noise stacked without sense. Instead, something grim took shape. Lines appeared, a lattice emerging from tones that repeated not arbitrarily, but with an architect's precision. The bursts came at measured intervals. Long low, short high, short long, split across storms months apart. When I synchronized them, they snapped into place like grid lines. Not music, not accident. A map thread coiling through the rainfall. My breath came shallow. I traced peaks with trembling cursor and began charting. Hours turned into marks on paper maps. Each node pointed outward toward a world too large to ignore. They aligned across real ground, the trench of a river crossing. An abandoned transmitter tower stripped hollow years ago. A government research lab sealed, long shuttered. The points were exact. Each burst from storm to storm stitched, their locations into one sprawling figure sprawled across the earth. I stared at the pattern. It didn't point anywhere I wanted it to. It sprawled indiscriminately across places tied to frequencies, signals, memory itself. I asked myself aloud if grief was bending my vision. Perhaps I was forcing connections, turning pain into geometry. Yet obsession carried me forward, nearer to conclusion than sanity. Notebook pages filled quickly with lines strung between nodes. My handwriting shook. I confessed into the recorder that I was no longer just investigating. I was steering by grief itself, using it as compass in storms that warped too neatly. Because only my own pain seemed loud enough to pull patterns into view. That terrible pull that whispered that maybe these bursts weren't faceless. Maybe they wanted me receptive because I'd lost so much. I tested the theory in the field. I carried newer recorders back into the weather. The forecast promised heavy front sweeping in by night. I waited in the open field near one of the older transmitters, tall steel tower sagging into rust. Rain came quickly, hammering shoulders, eyes gritty with streaming water. I raised the mic as thunderless bursts rolled out of the air. And then something frightening occurred. Listening raw through headphones as water lashed, I heard segments of rainfall that were not present. Snippets recognizable from earlier files. Ghost drops, ghost thunder. Rain I'd already recorded months ago repeating here, inside this new storm. It was as if weather carried across time itself, bleeding forward, replaying ahead of itself. Each crackle tilted me deeper into certainty. Someone or something was plotting routes through storms. Not random, not casual, but a design that spread itself loud across the calendar. I whispered my thoughts into mic while it sputtered under downpour, water dripping into pockets. I could not tell if it was madness or clarity, only that I felt certain. These storms were doors, plotted along trails cut through time, and every pulse led me further inside their geometry. I walked to the clearing by dusk, past walls of pine and damp earth. The air held no storm. The sky was bruised but dry, wind fussing through branches without water or charge. Yet the moment I dropped 2 recorders into the grass, the meters surged red, screaming overload. Their lights flickered, peaking violently as if rain hammered them, though the world around was calm. I crouched low, uneasy, brushing fingers across empty air to reassure myself nothing was falling. Later, back at the desk, I pressed play. What poured through the headphones hollowed me. Dozens of storms erupted together, an avalanche of rain, thunder clattering from nowhere, sheets upon sheets laid into the same minute. I muttered shakily into the recorder, like every hour raining at once. The description failed to capture the press of it, the awful vertigo in being smothered by temporal weight. The worst part followed. Between crashes of rainfall, I began hearing fragments of my own voice. Not memory clips, but scraps of sentences I had never recorded aloud, muttered thoughts I'd considered in silence. Words I had discarded yet present in captured files as if spoken. I choked on the sound. My throat stung as I recognized tones exactly mine, repeated and refracted in ways my body hadn't uttered. Fear twisted that discovery into final clarity. This wasn't forward throw. These floods weren't signals moving outwards. They were reflections pouring back. My hand hovered above keyboard, mouthing the truth as sweat prickled spine. The recorders weren't capturing, they were receiving. Futures scattered, dragged backward, settling raw into present devices. The lattice I'd charted wasn't broadcasting messages ahead. It was memory rebounding from tomorrow into now. Proof hummed in tape, each burst not echo of past storms, but weight of coming ones collapsing into a single false present. It meant every rainfall might contain events not yet lived. My gut nodded. I struggled between awe and dread. If storms carried future recordings, then every file was listening post, every downpour a fissure in chronology. My voice into microphone trembled, admitting I wasn't ready, and yet I could not stop. By midnight, I returned to clearing, soaked this time not by weather but sweat and haunted clarity. I carried my recorders into empty sky and announced my intent. I told myself this would not be accidental bleed-through. This time I would step deliberately into the current, test exposure under conscious choice. Rain or no rain, storm or silence, I would invite whatever reached backward. I laid the recorders out in a crude circle across the floor. Each device synced by hand, timers aligned as close as fingers could manage. I wired headphones through a junction of adapters so that their signals layered all at once. My notebook bristled with notations, scribbles of peak intervals I had mapped from old storms. The idea wasn't elegant, just desperate. If the hum wanted order, then I would build a framework where every pulse collided in union. When I switched them on together, silence at first. Then faint ticks appeared, scattered. As minutes passed, the beats began fusing, one recorder's spike lining with another's dip, until suddenly everything steadied. The floor trembled beneath me. The hum bloomed into a drone so thick it quaked bone. Not storm sound now, mechanical, a rhythm of some hidden machine working beyond the air, beyond normal scale. It filled my chest cavity with vibration. I crouched close, adjusted levels. Through the hiss emerged faint forming shapes. I held still, muscles locked. At first mere shadows of reversed syllables, drawn-out vowels skewed backward in time. Then clarity sharpened. A name, my pulse collapsed. My lost one's name, whispered out of the distortion. Bent but undeniable. My hand slammed to mouth, choked. I looked about the empty room, half expecting a body to appear. Nothing but my array of plastic recorders blinking. Yet the voice pressed again, slipping backward from the hiss. A syllable cracked, contorted. My body knew it before brain accepted. I fumbled at the controls. Hands shook so badly, I accidentally dropped mic levels to near mute, terrified of hearing more. For seconds I sat in airless panic, trying not to sob into the feed. But fear didn't hold. My fingers reached back, cranked dials higher, demanding the voice again. Rebecca, the name again, and then silence, like the signal had retreated, withholding. Everything quivered inside me. Purpose surged crueler than terror. I understood then why I couldn't quit. This wasn't intrigue alone, it was compulsion. That sound had reached across fabric not meant to bend, and whatever sanity frayed. I couldn't stop reaching back. Through the storm-taped hiss I whispered back. Voice fractured, as if microphone array were door. I felt rain no longer as weather, not ambience, but barrier. Thin veil stretched taut, membrane punctured deliberately by hands unseen. I uttered explanations, grief, confessions flung into static. For long seconds, the only answer came in warped echoes, hints of syllables repeating without closure. A part of me knew these logs consumed stability. With every test I drifted further from shared world, deeper into fabric not meant for living ears. But even while sanity strained, I knew the cost was already chosen. There was no way back now. Each pulse was hook, dragging me nearer to a crossing point unavoidable. The storm had been building for hours, pressing heavy on the roof, clattering at the windows with relentless bursts. I set everything in place, array linked, recorders primed, levels tuned to spike when the hum arrived. For the first time, I told myself I wasn't only going to listen. I was going to speak back. I rehearsed sentences under my breath, short and direct, afraid of wasting the chance. I waited until the hum grew loud enough to quake the floorboards, then pressed record and leaned close. My voice faltered at first, brittle as broken glass. I steadied breath, forced the words out. Spoke the name. Spoke my plea. Spoke broken half-confessions I had hidden since their absence left me hollow. I closed my eyes, desperate, whispering against the thick drone like it was an open doorway. Rain exploded outside, thunder clawed at sky, but all I heard was my own breathing and the coarse hum that swallowed it. I begged something I swore I'd never do, not into technology, not into static, but there I was, begging. I fell asleep eventually, head cradled in arms at desk, storm still alive outside. When morning slid weak through blinds, I opened my eyes raw with ache. I hit playback, chest tight, praying for the impossible. At first the file rolled as expected, storm, hiss, but my voice was missing. Each sentence I'd spoken, each shake in my tone, had been erased, gone. In its place the rain layered thicker, obscene in its density, as if to mask everything I had offered. The file bristled too loud, water thrashing without pause, unending. I skipped through timestamps, scrolled logs hungrily. Blank gaps stared back. My careful notes dissolved into emptiness, metadata missing. Pockets of absence filled only with false rain noise. Not corruption, not skipped file segments, but deliberate overwriting. It was as if something had captured my words, then sealed them away, splicing over with deeper storms. I stared until my hands went numb on the keyboard. The headset slid from my head, earbuds clattered to desk. I recorded a low journal entry, admitting defeat. I said the words slowly, voice cracking. Despair filled my throat thicker than rain outside. The storm subsided beyond the windows, leaving still air brittle and raw. No triumphant hum, no pulse. Only silence stretched long, dreadful in its weight. Have I risked everything, I whispered, for static only? Sleep took me in shivers. When the first light of dawn returned, I stirred at a faint click. My eyelids peeled open to see the recorder's light alive again, though I hadn't touched it. The file armed itself, rolling uncommanded. Curious fear pinned me still. Out of the speakers trickled a sound that should not exist in dry morning, whisper thin rainfall. Hushed and frail, coating my quiet room like fog. Something had replied. Not recognizably human, not shaped as I'd hoped, but alive all the same. The message arrived without warning, an audio file buried in my inbox. No header, no subject, just a clipped recording from him. The moment I pressed play, I heard his voice tangled with panic. Words cut short, syllables clipped, as though he had spoken too close to the microphone. He begged me not to continue, begged me to stop before I lost myself the way he had. I sat frozen, listening to his breath stutter, his throat hitch mid-word. Fear bled into his voice, raw and jagged, stripping away the casualness he'd always carried. He confessed in gasps. He said he had quit the work when something impossible happened. He hadn't dared to tell me until now. One night while running a test, he heard his own voice answer him back. Not an echo, not playback, but a clean reply, phrases he had not yet spoken. His own words returning to him from a point in time he hadn't reached. He stopped everything after that. He abandoned notebooks, scrapped devices, deleted logs. He said it broke him, and he couldn't understand how anyone could keep chasing it. Resentment twisted inside me as he spoke. Cowardice, I whispered, though it caught in my throat, because a part of me envied his ability to step away. Still, anger held. He had abandoned me at the precise moment confirmation appeared. He'd abandoned the trail while I stumbled further alone. Yet there in his file was a revelation more sinister than anything I had seen. I heard his recording replay, layered with a familiar wash of static. I pressed it again, slower, straining to catch the undertone. My pulse spiked. His file mirrored my own failed contact attempt from weeks ago. His voice interfered, overlapping with static the same way mine had. Only difference, the date on his file marked 6 months before I had ever tried. It was as though my futile attempt had traveled back, returned to him before I even dared to speak. Time knotting across itself, loops feeding loops until clarity burned away. I stared at the glowing length of the track, watching its duration roll. Disorientation hollowed me. Memories failed to line up. Had I always known this? Was I hearing his past or my future reflected backward? My chest squeezed with nausea. I called his number, desperate for grounding, but line after line rang dead. Emails bounced back with cold bounce messages. His profile vanished from systems like a name carved from stone and scraped clean. I sat in silence, speaking aloud into my recorder. I confessed honestly for once that I didn't know whether my memory was intact anymore. Each file gnawed away at certainty. My own thoughts felt rewritten, repasted from places I hadn't stood yet. The hum seemed to shape history as readily as it devoured future. My voice cracked, asking the question no log could answer. Had I already crossed too late into something irreversible? I leaned into headphones again, replaying fragments of static until ears ached. And then something cooler emerged. Layered inside the hiss, faint but undeniable, came words I knew by heart. It was my own confession, grief I had spilled weeks ago in darkness, when I thought the recorder nothing but safe vault. The system had pulled not from storms, not from silence beyond time, but from me. My file, my voice, my sorrow, now bleached into foreign rainfall and spit back to me as though it had never belonged to me at all. I pressed pause, trembling, and whispered to myself that the signal wasn't only pulling. It wasn't passive. It fed. It sucked recordings already lived, tore intimacy from memory, and looped it back dressed as anomaly. Threading personal truth into a lattice bigger than me, bigger than anyone who had dared to listen. By the time I realized my cheeks were wet, the file had rolled into static again. The weight of it sank. Nothing I spoke was safe anymore, not even in whispers. I thought for so long it was only me. My notebooks, my nights, my grief cradled in static. But then the posts began to appear. Anonymous fragments scattered across message boards, so obscure, even search engines seemed reluctant to index them. Lines left by hands unwilling to reveal themselves, yet unable to stay quiet. Each one described rain that stuttered, trails of hiss fractured with unnatural skips. Short bursts documented in shaky language, people saying it felt wrong in their ears, like seconds collapsing inward. They sounded frightened. They sounded familiar. I read with breath held, leaning close over glowing screen. One user described hearing family voices submerged beneath thunder during a summer storm. Another typed of rainfall that stretched too long between intervals, as if attempting to hold you hostage inside a single second. Each text bled with the same tone I carried in my private logs, disbelief tempered by terror. Yet this time, it wasn't my confession. It belonged to strangers brave enough to type. Unable to hold back, I reached out to one. My message was cautious but insistent. Days later, a reply arrived, itself shaky and short. He agreed to exchange files. What he sent hollowed me. A recording of a storm winding over his home, faint microphone hiss catching thunder. At first nothing unusual, then laughter. Light, high-pitched, unmistakably of a child. But the man explained in his note that the child had been gone for over a year. His son, taken by accident, never to laugh again, and yet here he was among thunder, giggles tangled inside roars of electricity. I sat paralyzed, lungs refusing breath. My own grief clamped down, because that impossibility was exactly the sort of cruelty I'd heard myself, listening for names I should never again expect. Suddenly, the lattice grew wider. It wasn't only me in the snare. It was anyone willing to listen too closely, anyone desperate enough to hear what couldn't return. This wasn't a private haunting, but something spreading across weather and ears. Using absence as bait, I began mapping reports. Each confession from strangers coincided with odd blackouts in archived frequency charts. Frequencies listed, then scrubbed clean with the same bureaucratic precision I had seen before. The pattern reared again, complaints of signal surges at the exact times catalogs simply cut out. Blank bands sealing truth from reach. Someone out there already knew. Someone had pulled curtains over Spike's most violent, editing history with a surgeon's calm dot. Then came the moment that chilled worse than storm. I clicked on one post detailing coordinates, pleading for verification, clearly written by someone unraveling under its strain. Minutes later I refreshed. The page was gone. Not deleted by user, but collapsed into empty error screen as if rewritten from the bones outward. Vanished under my eyes. I whispered low into my recorder, voice tight, heart hammering ribs. It's not me alone. It never was. The words shook, layered with dread and relief both. Proof multiplied tenfold, but with each addition safety shrank. Rain pounded pains that night, and as I leaned near microphone, I started parsing static for comfort. But under the hiss, I caught something sharper. A rhythm unfamiliar, less like breath or words, more like percussion of steps. Weight pressed faint yet steady, sound of boots crunching rhythm into layers of rain. My chest tightened with the realization that listening meant attracting, and attracting meant company in a form I hadn't asked for. It began like a fever rolling across maps. Storms flowered on screens, predicted by meteorologists, shrugged off by commuters. But behind their ordinary arcs, something darker pulsed. Reports surfaced everywhere, listeners indifferent. Cities describing the same interference rising through headphones at the same hour. I compiled notes rapidly, breath shallow, as messages spilled in, static bending speech into alignment. It no longer seemed localized. Whole regions were caught inside the same net. I played one recording through my monitor speakers, microphone perched to log it. Rain filled the space as expected, but soon other voices pulsed in the layer beneath. Confessions I had never spoken, never known. A woman begging forgiveness. A man sobbing as if to a priest. A child recounting a dream. None of it matched the weather outside. None of these people stood near the mic. They had been folded crudely into the rain itself, sewn into thunder with no care for reality. I whispered on my log that this was no longer bleed through, not ghost fragments from storm to storm. This was co-option. The rain had become a carrier pulled open wide, hijacked. Every drop was a note in somebody else's story, stitched into downpour, not their own. The city below my window bustled blind, pedestrians cursing wet streets, unaware that every umbrella shielded them, not just from water, but something layered, louder beneath. Fear mounted in me with each replay. What does safety mean when weather itself is compromised? Drizzle, hail, stormfront all turned theater for something else. My nights filled with clips and patterns emerged too sharp to ignore. Times lined with military files only accessible in redacted leaks. Each heavy rain spike coincided with missing stretches from weather radar archives. Blank slots stolen clean, gaps where data should exist. Agencies had already noticed. They hadn't stopped it. They'd hidden it. Then came his last voice. The ally I hadn't heard from in weeks left only one message. His breath trembled as he whispered, "They know what it does. They've built around it." Those words slammed into my spine. Built around it. A system not ignored, but nurtured. My throat worked dry. I scrabbled for his contact again, but lines stayed cold. Emails skipped from server to server, bouncing back with sterile failure notices. He was gone again. Lightning spiked outside my window, but in truth the sky was clear. I had left my arm to capture silence. My hand froze when droplets spattered across the casing, loud, heavy. Water hitting metal when no water fell. I bent forward, eyes wide at the dry panes, the barren street below. Yet in my recording the storm marched on, never ending, intrusive and absolute. For the first time I admitted aloud what my gut had feared since the start. This was no theory. No conspiracy stitched by paranoid hands. It had already breached. The storm was not waiting for me to invite it. It had stepped into the room itself. And it was never going to end. The charts drove me out into the night. Readings pushed higher than I had ever seen, spikes towering from raw logs like jagged teeth. I packed the recorder bag without care, meters, spare batteries, notebooks smeared with rain damage from earlier trips. The coordinates pointed into woodland marked restricted. Faded signs warned trespass, fine, and penalty, but the signals burned brighter than warnings could dim. The drive clawed through flooded roads. Wipers barely scratched surface water before glass blurred again. By the time I reached the tree line, thunder had carved across horizon. It was no normal storm. Rain slanted hard, pushing almost sideways as though in defiance of gravity. I stepped into it, soaked instantly. Meters shrieked when powered on, needles slamming red and staying pinned. Headphones pressed against skull rattled with distortion too jagged to comprehend. Above me, the sheets of rain seemed to fracture. Midway through descent they paused, shivering in air before slamming down again. Seconds collapsed in physics. Breath tore thin in lungs as air thickened like syrup. I whispered into the recorder, shaking, that it felt like walking through another storm entirely. Not Earth's weather, but something overlaid from elsewhere, time or future stacked poorly onto now. The ground rippled, puddles splitting, then stitching back together. I forced onward. Branches clawed shoulders. Lightning stabbed close enough to bleach the bark, but no thunder followed in sync. Instead, layered echoes piled, storm call looping back on itself in hourly stacks. One roll landed after another until hearing lost coherence. Then the tower appeared, half collapsed, a rusted ribcage against bruised clouds. It shouldn't have been active, but the cables proved otherwise. Unauthorized lines slithered from its base, buzzing faint but violent, humming with intent. Heavy weight pressed the air until my teeth ached against vibration. I pressed Mike tighter, determined not to shut it off. I whispered dread into the foam, confessing fear that my body might fracture inside noise. My hands trembled, but still documented, still rolled. Later at home, the playback carried my collapse of courage. But worse, the recording seared with a detail too precise to deny. My own voice narrated events before they happened. A half-minute head start, spelling what I would witness right as I listened. Each gasp, each word spoken ahead of my living throat. Reality or recording, one had already compromised. I had evidence, but evidence no longer meant safety. It meant I was walking half a step behind myself into whatever breach had already opened. And I was too late to turn back. The blackout fell without warning. One moment the city glowed with sodium lamps and windows alive in rectangles. The next, all of it sank into dark. Power grids dead, silence spreading except for the storm above. Rain drove across every surface, hammering rooftops, gurgling down open drains. It felt heavier than any storm before, weighted in more ways than water. I ran to the top of my building, recorders strapped tight, pressing my back against soaked brick as sky cracked apart. No light but lightning violent flashes, caught glass towers for breathless instants before drowning them again. Then the bands erupted. Portable radios whined from every corner, interference lighting air so thick it felt solid. Static carried not just hum but words. Voices tumbled over themselves, hundreds of them, shouting, crying, whispering, patched into the storm like endless broadcast. I spun microphones slowly across horizon, capturing the swell. The city groaned alive with sound not its own. Down in streets I saw people stumble out of stopped cars, clutching umbrellas that no longer mattered. They lifted their heads, lips parted. Some looked terrified, others wary, uncertain whether the voices breaking through air were real or tricks of thunder. A young woman screamed at sky, demanding silence, but was answered only by laughter of children woven into static bursts. Windows flickered with lightning. Shapes stood behind curtains, frozen, staring outward. Desperate faces clustered on intersections, their necks craned in awe and dread at the blanket of noise pressing downward. From rooftop height, it looked like the city itself was shrinking under weight of its own ghosts. Fear seared me. I whispered into recorder that this was the moment I dreaded, when familiarity would break. Not just me, alone, parsing grief. Every citizen now at risk of hearing their own voices stitched back from storms, their own memories bent and replayed. What chaos would follow when everyone realized the skies had become mirrors cracked backwards. Thunder stamped through bones. My hands shook as I panned mic, ears clawed by layers within layers. Then the shatter came closer. I froze as headphones delivered something no other ears nearby could confirm. My own voice. Clear. Precise. Speaking sentences I hadn't spoken yet. They overlapped, dozens of versions muttering ahead by seconds, tracing thoughts I hadn't dared form. I tore headphones away for a heartbeat, then forced them back on trembling ears. They continued, half-syllables of myself overlapping in distortion, predicting steps I hadn't made. Waves of me folding into rain until I hardly knew if breath belonged to present or storm by dawn. After endless hours, silence broke sudden. Lights winked back across skyline, ordinary yellow glow returning windows to safety. Rain eased to drizzle. Generators hummed. But weight did not lift. I sat soaked through on the rooftop edge, head in hands, recorder clutched tight. The voices had gone, but memory of them burned into marrow. They could not be scrubbed. My words had been multiplied, scattered in storm, returned as echoes before I'd even shaped them. It felt irreversible. The city might wake and forget. I would not. The envelope came without sender. Plain brown paper, heavy enough to hold just one thing. Inside, cushioned by cheap cotton, a flash drive lay cold as bone. I stared at it for minutes, listening to my own breath rasp against the quiet. My fingers trembled before slotting it into the port. A single file blinked into view. No name, no date, just there like it had always existed. I pressed play. His voice cracked through the speakers, broken into shudders. Trembling, weeping, he called out without addressing me directly, as if already speaking into void. He confessed that he had entered a loop. He remembered events not yet lived, days breaking in wrong order, fragments rushing into him that he hadn't walked through but carried anyway. His sobs filled spaces between sentences. He insisted time itself was fractured by listening, cracked apart each time our recorders pulled. The words tipped into wilder form. He whispered that he saw storms repeating endlessly, that he crossed his own path more than once, that he stood under rainfall knowing he had already stood there before, again. He said memory itself warped until he couldn't trust which child he had met, which stranger had smiled, which moment held truth. Loops nested him like a cage, every second folding inside another. He begged whoever received the file to forgive silence, because he wasn't sure whether any silence was real anymore. The last lines fell apart. His voice stretched unnaturally. Vowels distended until they clawed raw at the air. Consonants reversed, sharp syllables sliding backward. Rain rose beneath, but rain no longer sounded like weather. It was a grotesque distortion, twisted beyond recognition, scraping mechanical as if the sky were tearing cloth into shreds of sound. Then his words dissolved. The file ended harsh, unspooling in jagged static that cracked abruptly to black. I pulled the flash drive out, holding it in my palm like a shard of his ruin. My chest constricted with awful recognition. His collapse mirrored mine in miniature, the grief, the spiral, the obsession that bled until nothing separated research from mourning. I whispered into my recorder that the two had fused. Obsession and grief. Same vein, same heart. I no longer knew which one guided my hand, but they were indistinguishable now. Yet even as fear drowned me, one truth hardened in my throat. If storms are doors, then someone built that frame. Intention hung inside every hum, every pulse. Random chaos never carved corridors so precisely. Every door beckoned, however dangerous, and the lure burned even sharper now that my one ally had been erased inside. I placed the drive in a drawer, but left my recorders armed as night returned. Their small lights glimmered like eyes. Somewhere in circuit's low hums began to crawl again, rolling without consent. Whether I wanted it or not, the doors listened. The storm was already waiting. The sky cracked open long before I reached the hill. Sheets of rain carved sideways across steel fencing, rattling down metal as if rattling bones. I had packed every recorder I owned, strapped with wires into an array draped over me like armor. Each device blinked, already catching air dense with charge. I felt it crawl over skin, weight pressing heavier than atmosphere. Thunder didn't roll naturally. It fractured, doubling back into itself, clattering in disjoint bursts. The storm felt staged, orchestrated for this moment. I stood in the peak, water biting eyes and lips, hair plastered across my face. I raised the central mic, whispering hoarsely into its foam. Static bloomed so loud it resembled a lion's roar, spilling violent through headphones and gut alike. I braced myself, speaking haltingly into it, breath torn apart with each syllable. If crossing means erasure, I said, then listen close. This is my proof. Each word fought thunder, barely escaping throat. Seconds fractured around me. I stepped forward and the echo doubled, footsteps tripping ahead of myself, reverberating half a second too soon. Objects shifted in corner of vision, as if leaping frames. Umbrella dropped by path blinked twice. There then gone, then back again. Time no longer moved fluid, but staggered, splintering across invisible fault lines. My balance swayed on melted ground, legs shaking. The storm's noise thickened, tones coalescing into structure. From the roar of rain pressed a narrow band, precise hum shaping spine and ribs alike. My breath quickened. In audio, the storm collapsed, no longer water, no longer thunder. Silence blared immense until pulse rose underneath, steady and low. Not storm. Not machine, heartbeat. I clutched microphone tight enough to bruise palm. Fear knotted deep, but awe overpowered. I gasped into the recorder, words fractured and trembling. I can see them. I can see the shape. Through sheets of light and shadow, through fractured seconds, there was a figure barely held together, bent like reflection across broken glass. The outline of who I lost stood there, fragile but undeniable, caught in the weave of sound. Tears blurred my sight. I did not know if this was memory, hallucination, or a real breach into something unbearably beyond. The heartbeat pulse throbbed louder, filling my chest cavity, sinking breath and rib. The figure leaned closer, edges warping like static sketches. I whispered again, broken. Is it you? The storm closed its grip. Recording ended, violently snapped clean with a sharp breath torn from my throat. Sealing moment before it could truly be named. Days passed before I found courage enough to face the tape again. It waited in the machine, armed, already stamped with my name, though I swear I never pressed record. My palms sweated as I pushed play, as if I were about to hear a stranger's secret instead of my own. The voice that came out curled me in the chair, that it was mine. Shredded, fractured. Words bent sideways, split into loops that caught after every few seconds. Whole sentences repeated. Some familiar confessions I remembered speaking weeks ago, others foreign. Things I knew in bone but could not recall ever saying aloud. Each return pounded memory like hammer against glass. I sat frozen, whispering confusion into air. I had no memory of making this file. Yet it unspooled with precision, each beat as if prepared in advance. The phrases fell apart. I muttered about circuits, grief, storms as doors. Then mid-tape the pattern shifted. Thoughts I had hidden silently, barely conceived in silence of sleepless nights, surfaced in sound. My jaw locked. Things I never spoke breathed, living through the spool now, dragged from interior and stamped as evidence. The copy held more of me than memory did. Institution after institution stayed silent. Their walls of bureaucratic denial grew higher, but cracks spread across continents. Leaks seeped in obscure corners, foreign stations briefly acknowledging anomalies before retracting them. Rumors of aircrafts grounding mysteriously during rainfall surfaced, only to vanish within days. I watched from my small room, tape turning, knowing silence is another word for witness. The proof already bled wider than my hands could cage. The file's end carried weight of sermon. My own voice slowed until syllables thickened. The confessional tone bent down, eyes unseen staring into future. With choked tears, I said words that cut me raw even as I heard them now. When the storm comes, would you dare record? The question lingered like a wound, heavy, intimate, inescapable. I didn't remember asking, yet I heard myself demand it. Sliding blade between listener and veil. Rain swelled faint behind closing silence. Slim drops, rhythmic, climbing steady into speakers, though outside the sky was pale and bare. No clouds touching horizon. The false weather grew sharp against real stillness, and the layers ran over each other until even the silence around me trembled. The tape ended not with resolution, but with rupture. Static punctured the space one last time. Jagged, ugly, searing itself into room long after the machine had clicked to stop. Nothing ended. Nothing resolved. Only breath caught, time wounded, and the storm humming just beyond.